Her research interests include security in Central and Eastern Europe, Russia, Germany, German foreign military policy, as well as the role of women in peace and security. Prior to joining ASPI in 2017, Jacky was a program assistant at the Warsaw office of the German Marshall Fund of the US. She's completed a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science law at the University of Munster and a Masters in Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of St Andrews in Scotland. She has lived in Russia. She was born in Germany. She lived in Russia. She lived in Poland, and she's worked at the Moscow German newspaper. She currently co-edits a current affairs blog at the PACT Online and contributes to a selection of national and international political outlets. We chose this topic and we asked Jacqueline to speak to us today because we think that there's a significant risk in not keeping a close eye on what Russia's intentions are, particularly in relation to the Pacific. So would you join with me today as we welcome Jacqueline Westerman to the dais.
So thank you for inviting me and having me. It's a great honour to be able to talk about what I'm passionate about. As a guest in this country, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. On the land we meet today, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, I would like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and forthcoming, and pay my respect to all Aboriginal people here today, wherever you may come from. There's no doubt about Russia being a European and Asian country. Eurasianism has been a popular theme over centuries, underlining the size and presence of the largest country in the world, and the role of a bridging power between the two continents. Particularly, President Putin has been making use of this Eurasianism concept to find a tone uniting the more than 100 ethnicities across the country, and establishing a narrative underscoring the country's connection to both regions. The latter became very apparent in an OPAD President Vladimir Putin published in various news outlets across the region prior to last year's APEC meeting in Da Nang. On a side note, this took out 2 full pages in the Canberra Times. It is important to remember that Russia has also a Pacific coast. Maybe Russia is not a Pacific country in the same sense we perceive countries such as Japan or Australia as Pacific countries, but aside from its coastline, Russia also has historic relations with countries in the Pacific Ocean, let alone interests in the region. The Kremlin has the aim to return to the global power stage, which became evident with its involvement in Syria, the Middle East in general, increasingly across the African continent, and a stronger focus on the Asia-Pacific region. While the main focus remains on Northeast Asia, relations across the Pacific are increasing. Moscow has become an ASEAN dialogue partner and participated last year in the 4th ASEAN Defence Minister meeting. It is often claimed that the Kremlin has only undertaken a pivot to its east, following the derailing relations with the European Union and others over the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. However, Russia has been aware of its Asian part and relations with eastern neighbours for much longer. History professor Mikhail Pagadin from Moscow University was a pan-Slavist and imperialist who thought Russia was superior to the people and nations of Eurasia. He wrote in 1856, I quote, "Leaving Europe alone, in expectation of more favourable circumstances, we must turn our entire attention to Asia, which we have almost entirely left out of our considerations, although it is precisely Asia that is predestined primarily for us." End quote. A foreign and security policy reorientation to the Asia-Pacific, however, occurred more visibly more recently. That should not lead to the assumption that Russia and the Soviet Union prior to its fall didn't have flourishing relationships with the Asia-Pacific region. Moscow's stronger focus coincided with the US pivot to the Pacific and Asia. After all, one of Moscow's main concerns is to counterbalance US influence in its areas and regions of interest. The recent developments of relations with the West hitting rock bottom only accelerated the focus on the Asia-Pacific. Anatoly Antonov, former Russian Deputy Minister of Defense and currently Russia's ambassador to the US, highlighted at the Shangri-La Dialogue on the 5th of June 2016 Russia's interest in the Asia-Pacific. He said Russia was looking for partners in the region to create, and I quote, an equal and indivisible security environment, end quote, serving everyone, and that it wanted to, I quote again, enhance its military ties with the Asia-Pacific countries in order to strengthen peace and stability, end quote. The main motivating factors to take a stronger stand in the Asia-Pacific are the increased demand for natural resources and energy from the region's growing population, emerging investment possibilities, and increasing military budgets, all of which are creating both new markets and security demands. Russia has been investing more in its Far East military capabilities, particularly the Pacific Fleet received updates. As part of the global presence capabilities, the Kremlin thus has the ability to be more involved in the region, especially when vital national security aspects of Russia are at stake. Russia is the second largest arms seller in the world. 23% of the total global market in arms sales is taken up by the Kremlin. And following Russia's Syria campaign, the demand, for example, for Su-24S and Su-34s allegedly doubled. The Asia-Pacific has become the largest market for arms. Between 2011 and 2015, 43% of all arms exports to the Asia-Pacific came from Russia. Standing out was Vietnam, which increased its arms imports by around 700% from 2006 to 2016, jumping to position number 8 on the global arms importers list, according to CIPRI. 70% of Russian arms exports from 2011 to 2015 went to 4 countries, 3 in the Asia-Pacific, India, Vietnam, and China, the other one being Algeria. 80% of China's arms imports are from Russia. Russia's arms exports to the region are impacting the strategic environment there and have the power to shift dynamics in the near future, as Moscow can establish itself as an alternative to Washington or Beijing, both when it comes to security provision as well as the preferred go-to nation. The Kremlin has been following its ambitious goal of returning to the global power stage, even if the choice of tools to do so are seen with a worrying eye in the West for obvious reasons. One of the areas where Moscow has increasingly taken a stand has been an international mediator, for example in Syria. Again, the way the Kremlin has been doing such should not be forgotten about, and critical analysis is vital in this regard. Another potential area of getting involved in the interest of fostering international security and stability could be North Korea. Consequently, to highlight Russian interests and relations with the Asia-Pacific, an overview with selected countries from the northern end of the Pacific to the south, closer to Australia, will follow. I should note, however, that today's format will limit the extent to which I can dive into the relationships across the region, as well as the depth thereof with Russia, both in historic as well as intensity terms. I have mentioned the Kremlin's ambitions to play a bigger role internationally and influence global security before. The Korean Peninsula is not the top priority for the Russian government, and the Russian government usually does not come to mind in the first thought of players that are involved in finding a long-term solution to the stability and security on the Korean Peninsula. And still, Russia is often an overlooked player around the Korean Peninsula. It has geopolitical, strategic, economic, and national policy interests that drive a greater engagement in current security processes on the Korean Peninsula. Moscow has had a long historical economic and political relationship with the Koreas since the end of the Cold War, also again increasingly with Seoul. It is not only an illusion from the Kremlin that they should play a role in security discussions around the peninsula. Pyongyang also values the neighbour to its north. It shares a border of 18 kilometers with Russia. According to experts, it sees Moscow as the least unreliable stakeholder among the involved parties around the peninsula. Hence, Kim Jong-un and other officials have not only increased their visits to China immensely lately, but also to Russia. The countries are connected through a long historical partnership, and Moscow remains one of the last economic partners to North Korea, a relation with roots in the times of the Tsars. It was the Soviet regime that installed the Kim regime after the Second World War. Pyongyang existed beyond the Korean War, thanks to Chinese ground support and immense Soviet air power, with Moscow taking on most of the reconstruction aid after the war as well. The Soviet Union and North Korea were bound through a friendship treaty signed in 1961 that until the mid-1990s included a mutual defense clause. After some cooling of the relations, mainly due to the fact that Moscow established functioning relations with Seoul, the last years saw Pyongyang and Moscow moving closer to each other again. However, the Kremlin continues to condemn the nuclear advances as well as every missile launch attempt from its neighbour as well. Russia's ideal outcome of negotiations would be a stable Korean peninsula with US presence on and around it reduced, and regional nuclear proliferation ambitions halted. Stability would allow exploring more economic ties within the region, for once allowing following through on bigger infrastructure and energy projects, and potentially sparking investment into the Russian Far East, which is deeply in need of development and could consequently please the Russian domestic audience. There's another factor for the home front. An important narrative the Kremlin would like to foster is the alleged insufficiency of sanctions. After all, North Korea managed to develop some sort of nuclear capability and development, and regardless of decades of international sanction regimes, the regime has not imploded, despite analysts predicting so multiple times. The Kremlin would be able to highlight that sanctions cannot influence or even lead to a regime change, an important message to convey since the country has become subject to sanctions itself in recent years. Furthermore, potential Russian international involvement in another region would offer another distraction from domestic policy issues such as the contested pension reforms or manipulating regional elections. So, to summarize this part, Moscow would appreciate to be in a position that lets it influence the security developments around the Korean Peninsula. It can continue to counterbalance US influence in its immediate neighbourhood and beyond, can potentially develop economic ties and cooperation, and send an important message to its domestic audience. Australia, as a part of the Indo- or Asia-Pacific security arena, can be affected by developments in Northeast Asia, not least because it is a security guarantor to South Korea since the Armistice Agreement in 1953. Therefore, Canberra should have an interest in which players actually are involved in security developments up north, as a potential conflict could have vast impacts on Australia's security and economic interests. The relationship between Russia and Japan can fill an entire lecture itself. Therefore, it will only be touched upon shortly today. The relationship between the two has been dominated by conflict and dispute over the centuries. Today's relationship is mainly dominated by the territorial dispute over the Kuril Islands, which is a major obstacle to closer cooperation between Tokyo and Moscow, and both are painfully aware of that. Heads of state and government officials continue, nevertheless, to meet and explore opportunities that would allow for moving closer together. As Japan remains a close ally to the US and security partner to Australia, any such move would certainly raise eyebrows in the respective capitals and in the region certainly. A very recent development, therefore, deserves some attention and inclusion in any strategic thinking addressing the Asia-Pacific. Earlier this month, in Vladivostok, Russia held the annual Eastern Economic Forum that explores investment and business opportunities in its eastern regions and the neighbourhood. Last year's iteration saw statements highlighting closer cooperation between Seoul and Moscow, with both presidents affirming mutual cooperation. This year, most media reports focused on China and Japan attending the forum. Especially the outcomes of the bilateral meetings between Prime Minister Abe and President Putin were interesting. They agreed to look into possibilities to foster joint economic projects across the disputed island territories without having to preset a legal environment solving the island conflict, which, however, both sides agreed to should remain the long-term goal. Finding a solution to the dispute eventually would also allow Tokyo and Moscow to formally end World War II and sign a peace agreement. Another important issue of discussion during the forum's meeting was that both sides would appreciate closer defense cooperation. At the end of July of this year, Japan and Russia already held a 2+2 meeting, the third of these kind of meetings between their respective foreign and defense ministers. As Japan's strategic environment is significantly changing, it is exploring new avenues. The possibility of a closer defense relationship should be very well studied and observed in Canberra, and DC for that matter, as Japan has often been cited to be a like-minded country, and closer defense cooperation with Russia would certainly be a worrying development. The Eastern Economic Forum was held on the sidelines of an event that received a lot more attention across the world. Russia's largest military exercise in its history, Vostok 2018. Every year, one of the military districts in Russia sees a large-scale strategic exercise happening. Last year it was Zapat, so the West's military district's term, causing a lot of concern among Eastern Europeans and the NATO allies. With Vostok 2018, the Kremlin did not only send a message based on scale, involved troops and services, as the drills aimed to assess the readiness of ground, air, and naval capabilities. All those branches were involved. The most surprising factor was not the size of the exercise. It was that for the first time, Chinese troops participated. While China and Russia have made a 180 degrees turn and turned a historically long animosity into a strategic partnership, which has seen increasing joint exercises in recent years, China had never been invited to partake in these annual strategic level exercises ever before. Instead, the last Vostok exercise still saw China as a potential adversary, echoing the troubled past the two states share. Most of the last century was dominated by the Sino-Soviet border dispute that was only resolved in 1991. And Moscow perceived Beijing as an enormous threat to its national security, that even saw military reinforcements and investments into the military districts bordering China, as well as into the border force itself. The transformation of the relationship has been significant. Former foes are now close to being friends. While the word alliance has always been carefully avoided, the inclusion of 3,000 Chinese troops in Vostok sends a message. But China and Russia have not reached an alliance level yet. However, they have presented to the world, mainly the US, its NATO allies and partners, that they consider each other as potential allies, arguing that world developments have pushed them closer together, basically being forced to bond against the rest of the world. As the PLA has not had any combat experiences in decades, it must have welcomed the invitation, also in regards to having access to vital lessons learned from Russia's experiences in its Syria campaign. It is not every day that Chinese officers gain access to combat tactics and strategy thinking from Russian counterparts. President Putin declared the strategic partnership now to be a trusting relationship, and I quote him here, with President Xi chiming in, promising to, I quote, push the China-Russia relationship to new heights, end quote. A potential alliance between the two neighbours would not only affect the Asia-Pacific, but first and foremost the whole global security system, and would need to feature in any country's future defence and strategic thinking, but most importantly, in the ones of the littoral states to the Pacific. Let's move a bit further southeast. You will look without much luck for a statement on the South China Sea. Russia claims that it doesn't have any interest, nor is it involved in the conflict, which is why the government refrains from publicly commenting on the dispute, let alone from taking sides. However, the Kremlin has basically created a win-win situation for itself. It is the main arms supplier to both China and Vietnam, and benefits from the ongoing dispute that has seen the ramping up of military capabilities on both sides. That plays quite handily into Russian overall strategic interests and pleases its arms industry. Speaking of Vietnam, Hanoi and Moscow just signed a new agreement in April of this year. The so-called Military Cooperation Roadmap creates the path for bilateral strategic relations until 2020. In it, Russia has agreed to deploy a rescue boat, train Vietnamese officers in Russia, and increase the number of joint exercises. Vietnam, who is a traditional client of Russian arms, has also acquired a so-called K-300P Westerman coastal defense system from Russia that could be deployed theoretically in this release. Moving a bit further east and south, we have seen an increase in Russian military engagement across Australia's border backyard. In December last year, an Australian Air Force base in the Northern Territory was put on high alert as two strategic Tu-95 MS bombers came near to Australian airspace without entering it though. The bombers had begun the journey from an Indonesian airfield where more than 100 Russian officers were present for joint military exercises between Moscow and Jakarta. While some analysts say they mainly gathered intelligence, the flyover certainly did one thing: sending a message on Russia's potential reach and strategic military capabilities. Those bombers, after all, can travel 15,000 kilometers without refueling. Aside from Indonesia, the Kremlin also has increased its military ties with the Philippines. Last year, the Kremlin donated military equipment to the Duterte regime, and after numerous port visits from the Russian Navy to the Philippines, Manila returned the favor and called port in Vladivostok last month. While the Philippines have had traditionally close ties with the US, recent developments might indicate a change. Russia is attempting to sell 2-kilo class submarines to the country, with potentially more deals in the offing. The Filipino ambassador to Moscow, Carlos Zareta, wrote on Facebook, "Russia is willing to provide brand new equipment customized to the specific needs of the Philippines at favorable financial terms, with reasonable delivery times, full after-sales service, necessary training, and without any political conditionalities or limitations." End quote. The Philippines also deployed its first ever defense attaché to Russia earlier this year. Further south, the Pacific Island states are among beneficiaries of Russian engagement. Similarly to arms donations to Manila, Fiji also received arms for free. In 2016, 20 containers, allegedly only containing small arms that were directed at the Fijian presence in UN peacekeeping missions, reached the island state. However, the Kremlin also sent Russian soldiers to allegedly train the Fijians in the use of the small arms, which fired up speculations that the shipment included other weapons as well. Other diplomatic facilitations include visa-free regimes with Fiji since 2013, with Nauru since 2014, Vanuatu since 2016, and since 2017 Samoa and the states of Micronesia. Worrying are the diplomatic relations of Nauru and Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which the island state recognizes. In return for recognizing, they've received aid from Moscow. Representatives from those republics, for example, now received an invitation to this year's Pacific Island Forum, meaning they sit on the same table as our government representatives. While the Kremlin is not a direct threat to Australia yet, awareness and attentiveness are well advised. Aside from the fact that Moscow, through different measures, is challenging the very system that Australia is supportive of, the international rules-based order, Canberra should also realise that Moscow's increasing involvement throughout the Asia-Pacific region, let alone the new concept of the Indo-Pacific, can cause regional power struggles. Russia is driven by its own national, economic, geopolitical and strategic interests. Engaging across the Pacific provides Moscow with diplomatic and economic opportunities, access to local economies, investment and militaries, for example, potential access to airfields and ports. That engagement and Russian presence bears significant potential to boost the Russian economy. Looking at trade interests in Australia's backyard, sooner or later, Australia might be in direct competition. And the fact that Australia is in a neighbourhood where many countries are potential arms clients of Russia should definitely feature in Canberra's strategic thinking, particularly with its latest ambitions to boost Australian arms exports globally. Especially with waning US diplomatic presence, Canberra should acknowledge that with the ongoing disinterest and turnaway of regional governments from Western governments, that players such as China and Russia will fill those gaps. Consequently, the Australian government should prompt more engagement long-term with the Asia-Pacific. Thank you.